Okay, so in this slide, we're going to talk about myths of endings. So we're going to talk about some of the personal endings as well as figures that are looked forward to in Judaism. So the first thing is an afterlife. Does Judaism believe in an afterlife? Yes. But I have here, you can see I have descendants, Sheol, or reincarnation. So one thing that's important to know about Judaism is that there are a lot of matters of theology or belief that are left up to the individual. Judaism is a tradition that encourages debate and dialogue about the tradition itself. The idea is that the Torah is the sacred text, but it is open to interpretation, and it needs to be interpreted and continue to be interpreted throughout time. That's how you interact with the sacred text. So the issue of the afterlife is one of these theological matters that there's not necessarily one Jewish teaching on. So Jewish people have different ideas about the afterlife. About what is going to happen when we die. And another reason for this, other than sort of this emphasis on debate and discussion, is that Judaism is really a tradition that is focused on this life. It is focused on matters of this world, on the Jewish community, on following the covenant, telling the story, remembering Jewish history. So the idea is that if you are good in this life, and if you do what you need to do in this life, you don't need to be too concerned about the afterlife because something good awaits you, even if you don't know exactly what that's going to be. So the ideas that I have here come from different portions of the Torah or different sort of common Jewish interpretations. So the Torah, the Jewish Bible, also doesn't talk a lot about the afterlife. That's another reason why this is kind of an open question for many Jews. Early on in the Torah, there are some descriptions of sort of having an afterlife through descendants. So for much of the Torah, there really isn't even a conception of life after death. The idea is that immortality comes through having children, your children having children. You live on in this world through your descendants. And so the best way to live on is by having many children, and continuing your life in that way. Then, as we get a little bit further into the Torah or some of the texts that are written later, there is discussion of a type of afterlife called Sheol. And this is the image behind me is sort of a medieval conception of what Sheol would be like or where it would be. And it's basically a world of the dead or land of the dead. So if you're familiar with the Greek concept of Hades, sort of like an underworld type place, that's similar to how Sheol is described in the Hebrew Bible. It's a place where everyone goes after they die. So there is a continued existence after death. You sort of transition into this underworld or world of the dead, and you're reunited with your ancestors. So it's a good place because you're reunited with people you love who have already passed on. But it really is just kind of a place where everyone goes. That's what life after death is. So there's also that idea that there is going to be a place that everyone goes. But there is a general consensus within Judaism that after death, at some point after death, you get to return to God. You get to reunite with God. You be with God in the afterlife. And that actually everyone gets to share in that. Everyone gets to return to God in a way kind of similar to the Hindu view. So even if you weren't a good person in this life, you get a chance to have your soul develop or to sort of cleanse yourself of those actions, and that eventually you will also get to return to God. So this leads to some Jews actually believing in reincarnation or something similar to it, because this idea also has become quite popular in Judaism, that after death, in some way, we get to somehow work out the negative things that we've done in this life, if we have done negative things. So some Jewish people understand that to be an actual reincarnation, that people are born into future lives, and that during those future lives they get to work closer and closer to God, so that at some point when they die they will get to return to God. Or it could be something a little bit more abstract in terms of the afterlife allowing for a continued development or cleansing of your soul. In some way, if you grew up Catholic, this might sound similar to purgatory, but something of a similar vein. So in general, this idea that there is life after death, that life after death eventually will involve reuniting or being with God, but that for many people it will mean that there has to be some sort of cleansing or purification or development of the soul. So as you can see, there are a lot of different views on the afterlife within Judaism, because this is one of those points of theology where there is no one specific teaching. So the idea within the Jewish community is continue to discuss, debate, have dialogue about these issues, and through that discussion, through that debate, the Jewish people can come closer and closer to the truth. But the idea is never to arrive at that final truth, because the sacred activity is the discussion, it is the disagreement and the debate. And so engaging in those debates and discussions is actually, having a divine encounter. It's having a sacred experience, because you are arguing or discussing, God and what God's plan is. So that's an important part of Judaism. Then the next point that I have here is the awaited Mashiach. And Mashiach is the Hebrew word for Messiah. You also had some readings this week in the World's Wisdom text about the Mashiach, or the Messiah figure. So within Judaism, there is an idea that there is someone who is coming in the future. This term, I guess I should start by saying, this term Mashiach means the anointed one. And originally it just referred to a king in the Jewish tradition. When the Jewish people first entered into their promised land and had control over that land, they had kings. They had a series of kings. When a new king was coronated, or sort of went through that ceremony of officially becoming the king, they would have oil poured on them and rubbed on their heads. This was a ritual ceremony of ordaining them as a king. So this is where the term the anointed one comes from. So that's what the term Mashiach refers to. So it starts by really just referring to kings. So there are several Mashiachs in Jewish history, like Solomon and David and other kings. Then as the Jewish people stop having actual kings, the term starts to develop, and it starts to refer to basically kind of like a future king, a future leader that will come. And this coincides with a continued persecution of the Jewish people. Remember, they're living in their land at this point, but they're not in control of that land. The Babylonians have conquered them. Then the Persians are in charge of them. Then the Romans are in charge of them. And each of these empires persecute them. Right? They suffer under the hands of these individual emperors and rulers. So the Mashiach becomes an awaited figure. And many Jews for a very long time believed that the Messiah, or the Mashiach figure, would be a conqueror, would be like a military leader, right? Somebody who would come and would kick everybody out of their land so that they could reside in and have control over their promised land again. So this was the expectation or the understanding of what the Mashiach figure would be. This is important to know as we move into our next tradition of Christianity, because this is the individual that many people start to identify Jesus with. As Jesus starts to perform teachings and healings, a lot of Jewish people start to think that he is the Messiah, he is the Mashiach. Because there was a lot of hope at this time that the Mashiach figure would come soon, because the persecution by the Romans was so intense. So Basically, this figure will come and he will right the wrongs that have been done to the Jewish people. Today, the idea of the Mashiach or the Messiah has changed, and there is a wide variety of interpretations of what this means. For some Jews, this is still seen as an individual, that an individual will come in the future, and that he or she will be a leader of the Jewish people and will, right the wrongs that have been done to them, will protect them, and will give them, control of their promised land. But for other Jews, they've come to interpret this figure more abstractly in terms of, well, maybe it won't necessarily be an individual, but it'll be more like a messianic age, that there will come a time when justice will prevail, when harmony and peace and love and justice will prevail within the land of Israel or within the world more broadly. And then also Jews who interpret this to mean, we shouldn't wait for this to happen. We shouldn't wait for this figure to come or for this age to come. But this means that it's a calling for us to create justice and peace and love on earth. We can be the messiahs. We are the ones who should bring this to fruition in the world. So you'll read some of the sacred texts about the Mashiach figure to see some of the descriptions and hopes that were placed in this figure. But just know today that it's still a very important concept throughout Judaism, but it's interpreted differently now by different communities and different individuals of what this individual or time or calling will be. Okay, then the last thing I have here is a term called Olam haba. And Olam haba means the world to come. This is a phrase that was coined by Maimonides. So the second word that I have here, this is the name of a Jewish theologian. So Maimonides was a very important, if not the most important, Jewish theologian throughout history. He lived in the Middle Ages, and he wrote a lot about Olam haba, the world to come. So this is, for Jews, this is the afterlife, that at some point in the future, we will exist in the world to come. But there are lots of different meanings and understandings within Judaism of what the world to come is. There are many Jews who see it as a heaven-like place, right? If we are good, we will get to go to this place where God is, where there is just peace and perfection and love, and that's what our existence will be like. That's what the world to come will be like. But there is this sort of general understanding that many people get to share in the world to come, that even people who have done bad things in this life will get to continue to develop so that they can also share in the world to come. And this isn't just a place for the Jewish people. That's important to note too. Jews, we'll talk more in the doctrine section about the idea of the chosen people. But for the Jewish people, being God's chosen people doesn't mean they are the only ones who get to share in this afterlife. Non-Jews as well get to share in the world to come. If they recognize God, if they love God, and they have a relationship with God, then they also get to share in the world to come. It doesn't have to happen only through the Jewish perspective. The Judaism we talked about at the beginning is a non-missionary religion. They do not see their version of the truth or their understanding or relationship with God as, necessarily the same for everyone. It's their understanding and their relationship, but other people have their own understandings and their own relationship with God. So people don't have to convert to Judaism in order to share in the world to come. But again, with this term, just like with the Mashiach figure, a lot of Jews also think of the world to come as a sort of a calling to make this world a better place, right? We shouldn't just wait for a future time of perfection. This actually is God telling us that we should repair the world, that we should make this world the world to come. Let's not just accept that this world is a place of suffering and injustice, but let's do our best to make this world a place of peace and justice and mercy and things like that. So that's some general ideas on the myths of endings. As you can see, there's not clear, precise teachings on it. These are areas within Judaism that there are many different understandings and many different interpretations of what happens in the future in general, as well as what happens at the end of one's life. Okay, so next we're going to move on to doctrine.